When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. Do you get the sense that the modern world is in some way on the decline? That we are losing our way? That something is going deeply wrong with our philosophies of life? Well, 80 years ago, C.S. Lewis had exactly the same intuition. In a series of essays, he painted a dark vision for the future, one where bad ideas have led us so far astray it will be difficult to ever recover. But these were not the bad ideas that many political thinkers endlessly complain about today. This was something much, much more fundamental. C.S. Lewis was concerned about the erosion of objective values, and in The Abolition of Man, he issues a series of stark predictions for the future. Here, we will examine them and see why Lewis thinks the modern world will fall prey to its own flawed philosophy. Get ready to learn why a belief in objective goodness is essential for a happy life, how following our instincts can let us down, and how arrogant pseudo-intellectuals like myself have sowed the seeds for the destruction of civilization. I'm particularly excited to look at Lewis's essays with you because I am exactly the sort of person he's trying to criticize. An agnostic, atheist, shallow-minded, rationality-obsessed fool. Bear in mind, Lewis's views were controversial at the time and have only become more so over the years. So while it's totally understandable that you might feel angry or dismayed at his ideas, it's important to try to examine them as objectively as possible. So, let's see what my worldview is missing. And for that, we'll have to step into the shoes of 20th century philosophy to find out what had got Lewis so worried. 1. The Abandonment of Values. Almost 2 centuries ago, philosopher and Europe's greatest moustache, Friedrich Nietzsche, called for the revaluation of all values. With religious belief in decline, Nietzsche saw an excellent opportunity to craft a new society with new values and a new morality to replace the old Christian ethics. He is just the most famous of a series of thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th century who challenged one of our most basic philosophical presumptions, that values are objective. Over in the Anglosphere, A.J. Ayer published Language, Truth and Logic that argued that value statements weren't even capable of being true or false, but were instead outpourings of emotion. So when someone says murder is wrong, Ayer thinks they're actually just expressing their emotional displeasure at murder. He and many others gave exactly the same analysis to judging whether things are beautiful. The old assumption of Plato that there is objective goodness and objective beauty was being cast aside. And these analyses of value statements have quite a lot going for them. It does seem a bit weird to say that things are good or beautiful objectively. If someone genuinely thinks that it is a moral good to blow up puppies for fun, how am I going to convince them otherwise? We agree on every fact about the world, but I think that one ought not to blow up puppies and he thinks that you should. For that matter, where do I even find value properties? If I go to the scene of a murder, where am I going to find the badness? Where is the simple empirical evidence for objective morality? Not just as a psychological concept, but as a metaphysical truth. It seems that when we make moral statements, we must not be talking about something external, but instead something internal. Or at least that was how Ayer saw it. His particular view, emotivism, has gone out of fashion, but the general idea that there are no objective moral or aesthetic facts still persists to this day. Many people, myself included, are personally quite sympathetic to this viewpoint. And while it is rejected by many moral philosophers, it anecdotally remains relatively mainstream. How often have you heard people say that morality is just a matter of perspective, or that everyone has their own ideas of right and wrong? Likewise, many of us will now resist the urge to call a piece of art bad or a waste of good paint, and will instead say things like, "It's not to my taste." It is a relatively common position that while science and philosophy may be able to establish facts about the descriptive world, the world of values is somehow looser, and that there is no objective answer, even in principle, to what values we should have. I'm going to refer to all of these views as values anti-realism, or just anti-realism for short. This is a bit philosophically naughty of me, as it lumps together a series of different viewpoints, most of which hate one another, and some of which are not anti-realist in the normal sense. Nonetheless, since they are all Lewis's target, it's convenient to give them a common label. Just bear in mind, it is a massive oversimplification to put all of these disparate philosophical positions under one banner. Lewis's view on values anti-realism is clear. He thinks it is a complete disaster. According to him, if we lose sight of objective values, then it is a short leap to our entire society breaking apart and everything we value about humanity being lost forever. And what makes Lewis's arguments so interesting is that for the most part, they don't argue that objective values actually exist from an analytic or philosophical perspective. He does not aim to demonstrate the existence of objective value facts. Instead, he argues that an anti-realist perspective is both unlivable and impractical. He brings the philosophical discussion down to earth and asks what society and ourselves would look like if we truly abandoned objective values. And according to him, it could spell the end of everything we hold dear. So, let's get stuck into Lewis's criticisms, the first of which deals with our motivations for action. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to either my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. How to act in a valueless world. In his wonderful work, Demons, Dostoevsky paints the figure of someone who has truly managed to give up almost all values, to the extent that he no longer cares whether he lives or dies. This character is Kirillov, and unlike many other nihilists in Dostoevsky's novels, he is a broadly kind and compassionate man. But he has been made almost entirely passive by his lack of values. He spends most of the novel waiting for the order to kill himself, and then does, even though he is a bit grumpy about it. He says that many others would do the same if they knew the philosophical truth, that there are no real values, and as a result one can will whatever they please, including death. And this character is an exaggerated version of what Lewis thinks will happen to us if we truly buy into values anti-realism. He thinks that we will slowly lose our reasons for action until we are made passive and dull. According to him, everything that we admire about the human spirit, courage, scholarship, altruistic kindness, and perseverance, these all rest on the foundation of believing that something greater than ourselves matters. This might be a god, but it might also be a belief in the objective value of human well-being, or a wish to promote peace. The important thing is just that we think that it is valuable beyond our own existence, or the existence of anyone else. For Lewis, no existentialist compromise where we merely have subjective values will do. It is only in the belief of actual objective values, as real as the camera that I'm filming this on, that will give us true motivation in our lives. For him, subjectively chosen values are a kind of sophisticated egoism, where we might do good for others and call things good, but it is only at the behest of a solipsistic meta-ethical view of what good means. In other words, we might do good, but our definition of good won't extend beyond ourselves. And there is philosophical precedent for Lewis's views here. Famously, Kierkegaard argues that it is from faith in something greater and more important than ourselves that we can find release from existential despair. And even the arch-absurdist Camus thought that we naturally strove for objective values. He just thought we had to unlearn this tendency. So Lewis is onto a potentially quite plausible thesis. But there is an obvious objection to make here. There are plenty of people who live happy, motivated lives who make no claim to having objective values. I would say that I am just such a person. I have my reasons for living and acting, but I don't claim that they're objective. But Lewis has a response to this. He makes the genuinely quite cool argument that I can't truly think my values are subjective, because if I did believe this, they would not have a consistent persuasive effect on me. I'm going to steelman Lewis's argument here, and also put it in a more classically philosophical fashion, as I do think that this is worth listening to. Lewis seems to think that if somebody believes something, that will have some effect on their actions. So if I believe that there's a sturdy desk in front of me, that entails certain things. It means I won't hesitate to lean on it without fear that it will collapse. But Lewis thinks that if I actually believed that my values were merely subjective to me, then they wouldn't have reliable motivating power. He argues this for a number of reasons. Firstly, if I believed that my values were subjective, how would I choose them? If I appealed to reason or preference to form my values, then I would be going in with a pre-existing idea of what can determine values and what cannot. According to Lewis, if I truly thought that my value system was going to be subjective, then I would have no reason to choose one set of values over another. And this choice would paralyze me, provided of course that I was starting out from a position of valuelessness. Furthermore, he argues that if I thought my values were truly subjective, that they only relied on me for their existence, then they would be very fragile. I could break them at any moment and not worry about it, since I am the only legislator and the only enforcer of my value system. There would be no power, real or imagined, that could hold me to account for following my principles, so they would be very brittle. For those Wittgensteinians among us, you might recognise some similarity between this argument and Wittgenstein's private language argument. And Lewis says that this lack of stability in our values will have consequences. We would lose the motivation to cultivate the long-term virtues that both make life worth living and we currently love about humanity. For Lewis, the only reason this hasn't happened to people like me is that the consequences of my anti-realist beliefs have not fully sunk in yet. We still have the habit left over from a time where people believed in objective values. But over time, this habit will fade, and without it, we shall become shells of our former selves. Lewis's argument here is quite subtle, and it's quite a lot to take in, but his overall point boils down to this. Totally subjective values would not be consistently motivational, since they would have no reason to be permanent beyond our changing whims. Whether you find this argument persuasive is going to depend on whether you think something you believe is totally subjective can be motivating and stable in the long term. If you do, then Lewis's argument falls flat because you'll think his predictions are just false. But if you don't, then you're likely to find it quite persuasive. If I continue talking about this argument, I will be here all day, as I find it fascinating. But sadly, we're going to have to move on. Because in many ways, this is the least of Lewis's concerns. Sure, values anti-realism will lead to the degradation of our long-term motivations, but then we can just fall back on our deeper primal instincts, can't we? After all, I may lose the motivation to become virtuous, but surely I'll always be motivated to find food. Well, according to Lewis, this route will bring us only misery. And in this argument, he finds a temporary alliance with some of the greatest philosophers in history. 3. Instinct, the will, and the way. Perhaps the oldest objection to values anti-realism and related views is the idea that it will lead us to a crude form of hedonism. And to be totally fair, there is some precedent for this. The Marquis de Sade might be one such example, at least when he wasn't in prison. But to Lewis's credit, he issues a much more sophisticated challenge than this. He doesn't claim that abandoning values and giving into instinct is undesirable because it will cause us to mindlessly pursue pleasure and make others suffer. He just says it is an unfulfilling and miserable way to live. At this point in his essays, Lewis is responding to those who think we could replace objective values with a close analysis of human instinct. That is, we don't appeal to objectivity to ground our sense of right and wrong or beautiful, but instead we see what our instincts tell us to do and follow those. We might not get perfect objectivity, but we will at the very least have a stable set of values that is shared between all people. Now, Lewis is very clever in his response. He doesn't argue that human nature is evil, as some have done, and he fully concedes we might have benevolent instincts, but he instead simply states that our instincts are too changeable and diverse to be relied upon. One moment we are hungry, the next we are thirsty, the next we crave sex. We might go from having an intense desire for baked beans to broccoli in a millisecond. We might wake up one morning with the desire to get drunk, but the next day we'll have a hangover and we'll swear off drinking forevermore. We also might desire two opposing things with no higher arbiter to tell us which one to pick. Lewis looks at all this and argues rather plausibly that following these momentary and self-conflicting desires won't lead to a happy life. This is very reminiscent of what Stoic philosophers used to say. For instance, Epictetus thought that total submission to our baser instincts would not be freedom, but instead a new form of slavery. Instead of being a slave to a human master, we would instead be slaves to conflicting and fleeting whims, never truly organizing ourselves around a unified will. The Stoics solved this issue with their own system of values, which they thought of as rational and objective. But our anti-realist cannot make this move. So Lewis says they would become much like the cautionary tale of the Stoic, a servant to the instincts they thought would make them fulfilled. Bizarrely, they would be both totally free and have no real choices, since everything is considered of equal value to everything else, apart from whatever was that minute's world-defining wish. This argument also has an interesting parallel with the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who argued that our natural wills would only bring misery in their wake if we failed to constrain them. This is because every time we accomplish one desire, instinctive or otherwise, another will quickly come to take its place. So not only will we be carried in all different directions by our instincts, but in doing so, we will enter a hedonic treadmill that will never bring us true fulfillment. According to Lewis, it is only by recognizing an objective value system that we can escape this vicious cycle. The reason the belief in objectivity is so important to Lewis is because it places values beyond ourselves, and so gives us good reason to sublimate any moment-to-moment desires to this higher system. As I said in the previous section, if our belief in values was merely subjective, then Lewis thinks we would have no reason to prefer it over our instinctive drives or our momentary whims, since in both cases the only authority we believe in is ourselves. So if we give sanction to break our own value system, who is to say that we shouldn't do so? But Lewis thinks that living such a fragile and changeable life will inevitably lead to despair. But perhaps his most extreme argument against the values anti-realists is that it will lead to the collapse of civilization as we know it. And this is just what we shall move on to discussing next. 4. The Abolition of Man. In George Orwell's 1984, he portrays a totalitarian society under the thumb of an omnipotent government that has complete control over not only what its subjects do, but also what they believe. And this control extends to the values of their society. The worth of creativity is denied, and the sanctity of human life is dispensed with. Instead of loyalty to God or morality or humanity, there is only obedience to the upper echelons of the party. It is exactly this sort of situation that Lewis fears will emerge if we abandon objective values and give in to the anti-realist. We have already dealt with two ways in which Lewis thinks a lack of objective values will destabilise society. It will rob us of our long-term motivations and reduce us to unreliable instincts. But this next argument is the real kicker. He says that values anti-realism will only allow the most powerful to craft new values for the rest of us, and for a small group of one generation of people to dictate what is right and wrong for all successive generations, using technology to maintain their vision of the future for what used to be humanity. Lewis asks us to imagine a scenario where true values anti-realism has taken hold. In such a situation, he thinks a vacuum of meaning will emerge. After all, many of us do crave a purpose beyond ourselves, and here that need would go unmet. In this case, we would become very susceptible to the powerful suggesting new values for us. Values that might not be in the best interests of either us or mankind as a whole. Lewis envisions that there will emerge individuals who have both accepted values anti-realism and have the requisite power to enforce their will on society. At that point, they will consider themselves free from any sort of ethical obligation, since they're essentially living in the gap between value systems. And they will have a terrifying question. What should the new values for humanity be, and how should we craft them? In such a situation, Lewis says there is no guarantee they will act in the general interest. Will they be willing or even able to design a more appropriate set of values than the ones we have inherited? Or will the new gods be much worse than the old ones? Do we truly want to replace Yahweh with consumerism or a political ideology, or maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number? Lewis clearly thinks the risk is high enough that we shouldn't take it. He essentially takes Nietzsche's Übermensch seriously and finds the idea repellent. Of course, since Lewis does believe in objective values, he also thinks that designing new ones in this fashion will lead us into grave moral error. And this is all granting the idea that the new creators of values will have benevolent instincts. They might just make the new value system the worship of the powerful few, creating a two-tiered society with the value creators and their descendants on top and everyone else fighting for scraps at the bottom. There will only be the valueless and the suckers that buy their sales pitch. It is worth noting that Lewis wrote these essays at the height of the Second World War, where the thick stench of Nazism was still in the air. There was little reason to think that designing new values for society would lead anywhere pleasant. Worst of all, if his prediction for the future came to pass, Lewis would say that we would no longer be human, since we would have lost any connection to our true consciences, and our values would be puppeted by a small set of powerful individuals, even if those individuals are long dead. Since Lewis thinks that our natural conscience is the essence of our humanity, we would then cease to be men at all. This is partly what he means by the abolition of man. And I will leave it to you to decide how many of Lewis's predictions have come true, and how likely they are to come true in the future. Do we now live in unmotivated, egoistic societies worshipping false gods that will never make us fulfilled? Or are we quite happy with where we are and the values that we currently have? I don't know the answers to these questions, and I'm not going to pretend to. But overall, I think the most interesting component to Lewis's challenge is to people like me, who are mostly convinced by the empirical and philosophical arguments that objective metaphysical values don't exist, yet also wonder about the psychological and social consequences of values anti-realism. What are we to do? Can we find values that still lie beyond ourselves but don't admit of metaphysical strangeness? Perhaps by affirming intersubjective values determined relative to our tribe or community, or by a lightweight values objectivity that uses more minimal definitions of truth and objective. Again, I can't answer these problems here. We've been dealing with them for hundreds of years with increasing urgency, and I imagine we'll be wrestling with them for a long time yet. So instead, I will leave you with this question. Let's say you think that there are no objective values, but you also accept Lewis's argument that the belief in no objective values will lead to disaster. What should you do? Should you pretend that such values exist and abandon your commitment to the truth? Or should you look facts in the face, whatever the consequences? Is the fact that I'm raising this question simply proof that I'm not yet a values anti-realist? All of these questions and more are raised by Lewis's essays, and whether we agree with them or not, I think they are worth listening to. So let me know what you think of Lewis's predictions in the comments, and I encourage you to read the essays for themselves, as there's been so much I haven't been able to cover here. But if you want more startling prophetic visions, then check out this video to see what Nietzsche thinks will happen to modern people if we don't act fast. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.